Act 3, Scene 1 of No Thoroughfare. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Chant. No Thoroughfare by Charles Dickens. Act 3, Scene 1. In the Valley. It was about the middle of the month of February when Vendale and Obenreizer set forth on their expedition. The winter being a hard one, the time was bad for travellers. So bad was it that these two travellers, coming to Strasbourg, found its great inns almost empty; and even the few people they did encounter in that city, who had started from England or from Paris on business journeys towards the interior of Switzerland, were turning back. Many of the railroads in Switzerland that tourists pass easily enough now, were almost or quite impracticable then. Some were not begun, more were not completed. On such as were open, there were still large gaps of old road where communication in the winter season was often stopped. On others there were weak points where the new work was not safe, either under conditions of severe frost or of rapid thaw. The running of trains on this last class was not to be counted on in the worst time of the year, was contingent upon weather, or was wholly abandoned through the months considered the most dangerous. At Strasbourg there were more travellers' stories afloat respecting the difficulties of the way further on than there were travellers to relate them. Most of these tales were as wild as usual, but the more modestly marvellous did derive some colour from the circumstance that people were indisputably turning back. However, as the road to Basle was open, Vendale's resolution to push on was in no wise disturbed. Obenreizer's resolution was necessarily Vendale's, seeing that he stood at bay thus desperately. He must be ruined, or he must destroy the evidence that Vendale carried about him, even if he destroyed Vendale with it. The state of mind of each of these two fellow travellers towards each other was this. Obenreizer, encircled by impending ruin through Vendale's quickness of action, and seeing the circle narrowed every hour by Vendale's energy, hated him with the animosity of a fierce, cunning, lower animal. He had always had instinctive movements in his breast against him, perhaps because of that old saw of gentleman and peasant, perhaps because of the openness of his nature, perhaps because of his better looks, perhaps because of his success with Marguerite, perhaps on all these grounds, the two last not the least. And now he saw in him besides the hunter who was tracking him down. Vendale, on the other hand, always contending generously against his first vague mistrust, now felt bound to contend against it more than ever, reminding himself, "He is Marguerite's guardian. We are on perfectly friendly terms. He is my companion of his own proposal, and can have no interested motive in sharing this undesirable journey." To which pleas in behalf of Obenreizer, chance added one consideration more when they came to Basle after a journey of more than twice the average duration. They had had a late dinner, and were alone in an inn room there, overhanging the Rhine, at that place rapid and deep, swollen and loud. Vendale lounged upon a couch, and Obenreizer walked to and fro, now stopping at the window, looking at the crooked reflection of the town lights in the dark water, and peradventure thinking, "If I could fling him into it!" now resuming his walk with his eyes upon the floor. "Where shall I rob him, if I can? Where shall I murder him, if I must?" So, as he paced the room, ran the river, ran the river, ran the river. The burden seemed to him at last to be growing so plain that he stopped, thinking it as well to suggest another burden to his companion. "The Rhine sounds to night," he said with a smile, "like the old waterfall at home. That waterfall which my mother showed to travellers. I told you of it once. The sound of it changed with the weather, as does the sound of all falling waters and flowing waters. When I was pupil of the watchmaker, I remembered it as sometimes saying to me for whole days, 'Who are you, my little wretch? Who are you, my little wretch?' I remembered it as saying other times when its sound was hollow, and storm was coming up the pass, 'Boom, boom, boom! Beat him, beat him, beat him!' Like my mother, enraged if she was my mother." "If she was?" said Vendale, gradually changing his attitude to a sitting one. "If she was? Why do you say 'if'?" "What do I know?" replied the other negligently, throwing up his hands and letting them fall as they would. "What would you have? I am so obscurely born, that how can I say? I was very young, and all the rest of the family were men and women, and my so called parents were old. Anything is possible in a case like that." "Did you ever doubt?" "I told you once. I doubt the marriage of those two," he replied, throwing up his hands again, as if he was throwing the unprofitable subject away. "But here I am in creation. I come of no fine family. What does it matter?" "At least you are Swiss," said Vendale, after following him with his eyes to and fro. "How do I know?" he retorted abruptly, and stopping to look back over his shoulder. "I say to you, at least you are English. How do you know?" "By what I have been told from infancy." "Ah! I know of myself that way." "And," added Vendale, pursuing the thought that he could not drive back, "by my earliest recollections." "I also. I know of myself that way, if that way satisfies." "Does it not satisfy you?" "It must. There is nothing like 'it must' in this little world. It must. Two short words those, but stronger than long proof or reasoning." "You and poor Wilding were born in the same year. You were nearly of an age," said Vendale again, thoughtfully looking after him as he resumed his pacing up and down. "Yes, very nearly." "Could Obenreizer be the missing man?" In the unknown association of things, was there a subtler meaning than he himself thought, in the theory so often on his lips about the smallness of the world? Had the Swiss letter presenting him followed so close on Mrs. Goldstraw's revelation concerning the infant who had been taken away to Switzerland, because he was that infant grown a man? In a world where so many depths lie unsounded, it might be. The chances, or the laws call them either that had wrought out the revival of Vendale's own acquaintance with Obenreizer, and had ripened it into intimacy, and had brought them here together this present winter night, were hardly less curious, while read by such a light, they were seen to cohere towards the furtherance of a continuous and an intelligible purpose. Vendale's awakened thoughts ran high while his eyes musingly followed Obenreizer pacing up and down the room, the river ever running to the tune, "When shall I rob him, if I can? When shall I murder him, if I must?" The secret of his dead friend was in no hazard from Vendale's lips; but just as his friend had died of its weight, so did he in his lighter succession feel the burden of the trust, and the obligation to follow any cue, however obscure. He rapidly asked himself, would he like this man to be the real Wilding? No. Argue down his mistrust as he might, he was unwilling to put such a substitute in the place of the late guileless, outspoken, childlike partner. He rapidly asked himself, would he like this man to be rich? No. He had more power than enough over Marguerite as it was, and wealth might invest him with more. Would he like this man to be Marguerite's guardian, and yet prove to stand in no degree of relationship towards her, however disconnected and distant.